I'm here to vote. Yeah, sure, I have ID. Well, I cut my hair. But you know who I am. Dear Rita and Moby, my mom says my great-great-grandmother was a suffragette. What does that mean? From Alice. It means your great-great-grandma was pretty awesome, Alice. 'Cause way back before it was the law of the land, she fought for women's suffrage. That's a fancy word for the right to vote. It seems kinda nuts now, but for most of U.S. history, women didn't have it. This finally changed in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. It declared that a person's right to vote shouldn't depend on their sex. Pretty obvious, huh? But generations of women like your great-great-grandmother had to fight for that right. No, the Constitution didn't forbid women from voting. It left the rules around elections up to each state government. Early on, a few states gave some women, especially wealthy ones, the right to vote. But in most places, women weren't allowed to participate in politics. They were too delicate, too emotional, too uneducated. You know, always something. Their world was supposed to be at home, raising children. And there were all sorts of laws and traditions to keep them in their place. Women couldn't own property or sign contracts. Their husbands or fathers had to do it for them. And they weren't supposed to make speeches, since it was scandalous to call for men's attention. But in the 1830s, some brave women started challenging these ideas. It happened when they got involved in the most urgent moral issue of the time. Not yet. In the early 1800s, that wasn't women's votes or even women's rights. It was abolition, the fight to end slavery. Slavery was still legal in about half the country, and many people wanted it outlawed. Women joined men in attending lectures, writing to politicians, publishing pamphlets, and boycotting Southern products. Free Black women started the first all-female anti-slavery groups, and the idea spread quickly. Some groups welcomed both Black and white women, which was almost unheard of back then. Working for abolition got women thinking about which rights they deserved. Take Sarah and Angelina Grimke, sisters from a slave-holding Southern family. They started out speaking to small groups of women about the evils of slavery. But then men started sneaking in to listen. By the 1840s, the Grimke sisters were addressing huge crowds and inspiring other women to speak up too, like Susan B. Anthony, who gave fiery speeches against slavery, and later for the women's vote. In 1848, two abolitionists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, organized the first women's rights convention in the U.S. The Seneca Falls Convention attracted about 300 people, including a few dozen men, like Stanton's friend, abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Among their demands were equal pay, access to education, and most controversial, the right to vote. 3 years later, Sojourner Truth delivered her powerful Ain't I a Woman speech. Truth had escaped from slavery before becoming a leader in the fight to end it. She hadn't been too delicate to do grueling work when she was enslaved, she said, so why was she too delicate for equality now? By the 1860s, networks of women activists had organized across the country. And when the Civil War ended slavery for good, they thought it was their time. Congress was sure to give new rights to former slaves. And suffragists figured women could get the vote too. But pretty soon, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. Well, for Congress, expanding who got to vote was a tricky business. It meant changing who would be in charge of the government, aka in charge of them. Granting suffrage to African American men was a no-brainer, because they would vote to change the South's racist slave culture. And not coincidentally, vote to elect the same congressman who just granted them suffrage. Score. expanding the vote to include women wasn't as straightforward, because down south, white women would mostly vote against reform. So in the end, the 14th and 15th Amendments gave voting rights only to men of color. For the first time, the Constitution protected the right to vote for male citizens. Yeah, lots of suffragists felt betrayed, and it was kind of a crisis for the movement. But actually, suffrage was starting to gather steam out west, like in the Wyoming Territory, where the political situation was, well, a little different. Wyoming wasn't a state yet, and lawmakers knew they needed more citizens to qualify. Plus, they just plain needed more women. The territory had 6 guys for every gal. So, to attract female settlers, they passed a whole mess of lady-friendly laws. Equal pay, property rights, and women's suffrage. When Wyoming finally joined the Union in 1890, it became the only state in which women could vote. By 1900, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho had followed. Yeah, by then, suffrage was the main issue of the women's rights movement. A new generation of suffragists, called suffragettes, was in charge. They'd grown up with more rights than their mothers, and they were shocking the nation by aggressively going after the vote. They protested, went to jail, even staged hunger strikes. In 1913, thousands of suffragettes staged the first political march on Washington. Woodrow Wilson was about to be inaugurated as president, and they hoped to sway him to their cause. Hecklers came out to boo and attack marchers. Over 100 of them landed in the hospital. But Wilson was unmoved. He still thought each state should decide its own voting laws. What finally changed his mind was World War I. When the U.S. entered in 1917, women across the country joined the war effort. On the front lines, they were nurses and ambulance drivers. At home, they took over farms and factories. Suffrage became linked with patriotism, and more states signed on. Wilson feared that if his party didn't support it, they'd lose the 1920 elections, big time. So he urged Congress to give women the vote. It took a year of debates in the House and Senate, but the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in the summer of 1920. I know, politics can be messy. Lots of times, our leaders only do the right thing when they're backed into a corner. And not everyone benefits from every step forward. Women of color still had to wait decades before the Voting Rights Act really gave them the vote. We can't ever take suffrage for granted. All of us need to pitch in and push our leaders to uphold voting rights. So anyway, can I please vote now? Finally.
I'm here to vote. You're kidding, right?